just want to kind of start off. My name's Nate Shirley. I work part of a team within HP that helps with application. As a consultancy, we work with our customers to help automate their applications for geometry. You might be asking, why are HP and Radii on the stage at the same time? Two very different entities, but we found that when it comes to applications, we have our domain of expertise, and we need to partner with companies that really know the application space and are pushing the boundaries there. So in this context, orthotics and prosthetics is a very viable application space, but the scale that a company like HP needs to be able to make it viable for us, we have to look to the automation space, like Brent was alluding to, that you need both the clinical side and the geometry side to be robust and automatable. And so just as a segue, Radii is doing an amazing job with that. And we've been working with them on a project with Veterans Affairs for the past year on how to help them digitize their prosthetics process. So just as an intro for Josh. Oh, that's what I just said.
Great. Thanks, Nate. So, hi everyone. I'm Josh. I'm the founder and CEO of Radii Devices. So, we're a fairly early stage startup using software and data to improve the fitting of all sorts of custom devices that kind of interface with the skin. So, they could be medical devices, but one of the kind of key areas we've been focused on is in prosthetics. So, I'm going to be talking about the socket fitting stage, and Brent gave just the most incredible introduction, and the work that he's doing is just mind-blowing, and he's really personally driving the industry forward. So he's given a lot of this background, but I'm really going to talk about why this fitting stage. Brent briefly referenced it in the kind of the clinical aspect, but this is really where the prosthetist comes in. So from the limb here, the bit at the top, the socket, the bit that Brent was talking about, if that doesn't fit right, that's where the kind of the pain, injury, and immobility will come from. Much of the time, these can take multiple refittings in order to get right. And in prosthetics as a whole, we see some fairly high rejection rates of these devices. So kind of, again, Brent's spoken about this, but the kind of traditional aspect of how you go through and create a prosthetic socket, starting with this clinical scanning or shape acquisition through plastercast, and then the fitting aspect. We then go into fabrication of this, what's called a check socket or a diagnostic test socket. So this is the essentially what's then used to see, okay, how well is this fit going to be before we move on to the final device, the definitive that the patient's going to take home and use. So my background is from mechanical engineer. I've kind of moved across, and my PhD was looking at fitting of these devices. And I think the thing that actually really grabbed me in this whole space wasn't just the kind of what can we do with additive manufacturing and device design, but really actually the fitting of these devices is probably one of the most interesting geometry problems I've ever come across. Because you might just think, okay, we've got the shape of the limb, we can take a scan. Why is that not enough? And so, a room full of many designers and engineers, I'm going to show you with a finite element model to demonstrate why. So if the limb and the socket were basically the same shape, so if we just took a direct scan, the fit would be unwearable. You wouldn't have any contact or shear around the main bulk of the limb, and you just get all of this loading at the end of the limb, and that's where the scar has been, that's where there's going to be lots of pain. So what people like Brent do, the prosthetists, they do this just incredible process where they take the anatomy of the limb and they apply a press fit around the main bulk of the limb. And this kind of provides the suspension, this provides the security of the limb within the socket to enable someone to ambulate. This then removes the pressure on the distal end of the limb. But the question is, where do you apply the pressure? And again, this is then where we start to get into really interesting areas of really what's computational design. So what we have, we're essentially applying a deformation field onto that initial shape of the limb. So kind of from the literature, you can see that there are these areas of the limb. So this is someone that's had a below knee amputation. So if you kind of feel around your knee, you've got all of these kind of bone structures or different soft tissues. And on some of those areas, you can put pressure and you can put that support to provide the suspension. But on other areas, you want to remove pressure because that's where it's going to cause pain. And so what kind of through the literature and through kind of decades of prosthetic experience have come around is that we've kind of got these two designs of prosthetic sockets. One, which is called a PTB design, which aims to put pressure on specific areas and then offload it on others. And the other one, which is called a total surface bearing design. So that aims to, minimize pressure gradients across the surface in order to get a good fit. So in a prosthetic clinic, the way that I look at it from kind of an engineering perspective is that there's this huge, complicated, multi-objective optimization problem that's happening every day. So when Brent's showing kind of, that plaster, that, what looks like quite a traditional process, the actual kind of optimization that's happening in there is incredibly advanced, because all they're working with is just being able to change the shape of that surface by providing loading in some areas, offloading out others to try and get this good fit. But we do see that there's a large number of challenges in prosthetics. So these devices are kind of near the limit, or at the limit of innovation with what could be done with carbon fiber and traditional fabrication. Adequate fit is a constant challenge, high rates of abandonment, and a really heavy reliance on a incredibly skilled but relatively small workforce for the ultimately the increasing demands that we're seeing for these devices, particularly in lower middle income countries or conflict zones. And there's a real kind of lack of objective data on best practice where you are reliant on these highly skilled individuals. So that's kind of then where we came in from an engineering perspective and said, okay, can we look at this problem as though it was like that optimization problem? Can we start to say, can we really understand what's happening within prosthetic socket fitting and then use data and machine learning to be able to support that process? So we started with a relatively small training data set within data science as a whole, 162 data sets. In prosthetics, this is pretty big. Bringing together these kind of data sets together is a real challenge. But on the top row, we have, these are all of the original scans of the limbs. On the second row, we then have those sockets that have been made. The third row, what you can then see is the process that went into the fitting. So the red areas are where it's being pushed in, blue areas are where we're offloading pressure. And then what we're able to do is we're able to create a parametric model of socket design. So we can actually start to look at, for each of these areas, what's happening, what are the decisions that the clinicians are making in order to get the best outcome for patients. And what I'll then kind of move on to talking about is that we then want to take this and wrap this within the clinical process. So what we've done, we've kind of gone from starting at a very clinical standpoint, then kind of bringing it into an engineering context, but how do we kind of take that back into the clinical context in order to make useful, valuable tools for clinicians? But what we can see is that even just by looking at this data, we can start to get loads of insights into how design work that weren't there before. So as I kind of mentioned, there were this idea, if you look in kind of, you speak to in academia, what people get taught in schools is that you've got these two very distinct socket designs, and it's either kind of a comparison of one or the other, like you're taking two different products off the shelf. But what you actually see is that the data suggests that's a real hybrid design. So when it comes to the clinic, prosthetists are taking inspiration from both aspects. They're using design variables from kind of one principle and matching them to another principle to get that output. So really kind of part of that optimization. So what we've then been able to do is we did a clinical feasibility study looking at the model that we'd built and comparing it to prosthetists. So would have the same patient. They would try on one prosthetic socket that was fitted using our machine learning model versus another one that had then been fitted by the prosthetist. So we framed this as a non-inferiority study. We want to say, okay, we always want to put the prosthetist at the heart of the decision-making process, but if it was used in what we would describe as state of misuse, where someone just said, yep, okay, I'll accept the output from the model and I won't think about it, are we still going to give a safe results? And so when we kind of did these side-by-side comparisons, we saw that the model was actually able to not just kind of get the non-inferiority condition that we were looking for, but actually in some cases really improve on the kind of the socket that had been made by the prosthetist. So I won't go into loads of detail on this, but we can kind of split it up between which of the sockets were more comfortable and which were less comfortable. And we found that the model actually, it didn't get as many kind of 10s and 9s, so it's measured in a socket comfort score out of 10 as the prosthetist. But those sockets which weren't fitting so well from the prosthetist, it brought them consistently up to about an 8 out of 10. And I think we've already spoken a bit today about the 80-20 principle, and I think you really see this here, the idea that we can use this model to generate a kind of 80% of the fit and allow the prosthetist to come in and really optimize that final 20% of getting the device to fit well. And so this is then kind of our software. So this is Reform, which is used. So this is a software for clinicians. The idea is that this gets used within clinical practice. The prosthetist can come in, they can change all of these different variables about socket design in order to get the outcome that they're looking for. Because the interesting thing about this as a kind of optimization problem is that you're not just dealing with the scan that came in. Yeah, you can take measurements and then decide on a socket design, but all of the different design variables interplay with each other as well. So if I offload pressure in one place, I'm probably going to have to put it on in somewhere else in order to get that balance. Again, multi-objective optimization, what we're kind of dealing with in all sorts of different domains here, but this is happening every day in a clinic. So just a few kind of quotes from our patients. So on the right-hand side, these are these test sockets, so that's what we used in the study. Nate, in a second, is about to start talking about all of the really cool stuff that we can then do with additive manufacturing on top of this. But really good feedback from patients about how comfortable the sockets were. Really, engagement from the clinicians as well, kind of saying that, okay, this can help get kind of 90, 80% of the way there, really helping them to dial in for their fitting. And so, really kind of positive feedback there. So that is the kind of introduction into the importance of fitting within it. I'm talking about prosthetics specifically, but any of these kind of devices where you're relying on this kind of device-human interface and it's applying pressure, getting that fit and getting the geometry right is just absolutely critical in terms of the outcome. You could go put all of the technology you wanted into additive manufacturing. If that fit and that interface isn't right at the beginning, you're going to get a failed device. But we see that digital methods enable us to create models which aim to improve outcomes and support the kind of challenge resources in the P&O workforce. So I think, and this is where I'm going to take over to Nate, but up to date, these sockets that have been produced through either kind of carbon fiber lamination have all looked broadly similar. If you go to kind of any technician within prosthetics, you'll get a similar outcome. But additive manufacturing really opens up avenues for product identity, innovation, and improved outcomes. But in order for it to scale, there needs to be this kind of consistency in the fitting process. There needs to be consistency in the processing as well. If clinicians using all sorts of different devices and it's not cleaned during that software process, that's going to be a really challenging problem to scale. But the kind of the most important aspect, and it's something that we constantly grapple with, is ensure that these methods can be embedded clinically, because it's very easy for us to kind of go into an engineering context and then, talk about all of these things, but ultimately this is about tools that are being used in the clinics every day. So that kind of balance of how do we take this data and these new technologies and make them accessible and appropriate for clinical practice. I'm now going to hand over to Nate to then talk about the next stage of the process, which is once you've got that fit, what are you then able to do with these devices?
Thanks, Josh. So that fit, I mean, just to be able to have that to show to the clinicians, seeing what they're doing represented in that way is already quite impactful. Without this foundation, you can't build the house on top of it that has any function. You're just kind of in a state of, useless innovation if you don't have that interface worked out. So from there, we see that companies struggle a lot, and that's in terms of how to automate the geometry. What Brent just showed is, probably a lot of work to come up with a system that can automate a 3D printable file. And you can probably imagine that from there, the complexity that we could innovate into these products is, is immense, and we want to have clinicians doing clinical work, and you want to have engineers doing engineering work, and so we want to bake that into the model and be able to do that. Now, the software landscape is a little bit scary today in terms of how you would go about doing this, and it's not comprehensive in terms of the possibilities. It's probably 3 times as many things that a company would have to look through to decide. So one of my roles is to help them make the right choices, because sometimes it'll be different based on what they want to be able to do. So they're asking, what scanners do I use? Sometimes it matters, like for a class 1 device, if they're doing like a cranial helmet, it might matter more than another device. But they have this, they know they want a 3D print, but they just simply can't get there through this mess. Now, Radii is solving the rectification, is what they call it clinically, that aspect in a way that is completely different from all these other programs that actually ask you to basically sculpt digitally. It's doing that for you and then giving you controls over it. And so that's why we've seen them as a front runner in this space, because they're taking that lift away. Because as Brent mentioned, it's actually fairly efficient to do this by hand. It's just not scalable in terms of talent. So if you go to a prosthetist and you say, do this digitally, and he says it takes, or she says, it takes me longer, I'm not going to do this. You have to actually provide benefits over the traditional process. Now, I have CAD design in there, but that's actually not part of the production workflow. That's part of the R&D workflow, the development. And so people are wondering, how do I design the product in the first place? What product, or if they're doing one-offs, how do I do that? If we're getting mesh data in, then going into traditional CAD is kind of a mess. So what's the better way of working with that? And there's lots of different ways to go from there into automation, all with different benefits. And there are a number of softwares that could complete what I'm going to kind of show you, but they have various advantages, and they may be better in one case or another. So I'm just going to walk you through, because I think it might be kind of interesting, the actual step process and designing this part. So this is kind of the level of what we're helping automate today, but we want to see our customers move into something with more complexity, but with purpose. This is just a show car to say, hey, you could do this or this or this, but we need clinicians to tell us that's a horrible idea, you should do this instead. So this is kind of like a question to the market, what should we be doing? And I got really good feedback at the last conference to say, why this doesn't work, so now I can improve it. But as far as the geometry process, I'll just kind of, go through the tree, and you can see kind of how it's very different than modeling in a CAD context when you're doing voxels and meshes to try and get consistency. And the reason we're in voxels and meshes is because they're robust, particularly voxels. They don't break, they can do offsets, they can do fillets all day long, and they just give you an answer instead of saying no, which is painful. So, we get this file coming in from Radii, in this case, and it's just a single surface mesh, right? What do we do with it? So we'll start to do a few things around the edges just to try and increase comfort, but then we need to create our Boolean tools. So we need to start creating ribbons, and this is going to be for the subtraction tool later. And then in this case, I wanted to provide some hint at the limb shape, so it'll fill out the pant leg in a nice way and show that that's a possibility. So where do you take the other side, if they have one sound limb, mirror it and bring that in. But then how do you combine those two models? They have really no correlation besides general anatomy. So we have the shape of the interior of the socket versus the limb shape. I'm just showing two sides of the same limb. And you smash them together, and that's not really helpful, right? So what do you do from there? There's processes that you can automate to say we need to get to a, first we're going to do some smoothing. But even then, that's not respecting the geometry right at the rim where we need them to come back together, right? So we actually paint an attribute that says, in this location, respect mesh A, and everywhere else, respect mesh B. And that gets us to something that has this constriction around the edge. You can imagine trying to do that in like SolidWorks. Good luck, right? And then I'm just truncating it because it's not going to be the full foot as well. We're subtracting that internal volume, and we come up with a shape that is different on the inside than it is on the outside, and that's your volume that you're going to start working with. From there, I incorporated some perforations, so we have a surface that we then scatter points across, and we copy to point cylinders for each of the perforations we're going to subtract. From there, there's some design elements where we want to not have perforations along the top or along the shin or along the bottom, so I'm tracing out some key curves that allow me to then subtract from the surface mesh to create a distribution of points for a Voronoi fracture of the part. So now I have my lattice mapping for this exterior pattern. So now you have all these parts disparately, the various Boolean tools you want to work with, and they're all overbuilt outside of the surface because you're going to trim it later. So you get some very odd-looking mid-steps, right, where you've overbuilt the geometry. You start to combine in those lattices, but then you start trimming away the outer surfaces, and it starts to look more like the end product, as well as now removing that interior volume and perforating, just so you can see a little bit more of the detail. And you can see, that's a perforated part. So the nice thing is that there are early adopters in the space. So I'd love to get a picture of one of your products up there, Brent, in terms of advanced digital, doing bespoke solutions and now moving into scale. But there are products on the market using HP's technology, MJF, where they are at various levels of automation offering these services. But having talked to most of these companies, I can tell you that sometimes they're spending 4 to 8 hours to design a part. And that's not scalable either. So we're helping them figure out how to make this happen in seconds instead of having an engineer constant, working on every one. Just so you can kind of see the process here of what a more advanced prosthetic looks like. You can incorporate all kinds of different details. This is with a company called Quorum Prosthetics. And they are incorporating these pressure pads using a BOA system, kind of like a ski, for ski boots and snowboarding and stuff like that. But it allows someone to have a different level of activity based on, being able to control the fit throughout the day or throughout their process of their activities. And then we're seeing it grow into other areas of orthotics as well. Cranial orthotics for babies, insoles for feet, and also ankle foot orthotics. So it's quite an interesting space, great application of additive. It's one of our key strategic focus areas at HP where we think that there's a huge amount of growth potential. And just kind of as a general invitation to this crowd, additive, computational design, and AI have all been accused of being solutions without problems at various points. It's kind of like a hammer you walk around with looking for a nail. But helping amputees is a real problem to solve, with very rewarding problem to solve. And we need more people with your skill sets in that space to drive that forward. So there's kind of a open area of opportunity there to innovate and have great impact. And then if you are going to do that, don't start by yourself. We can help you kind of get a jump start in that area. So as far as closing out, so we mentioned that part of the reason that Josh and I are connected is that we're working with Veterans Affairs on with their Office of Advanced Manufacturing for orthotics and prosthetics to deliver their digital solution or their changeover to printing their prosthetics. And it involves a number of parties, as you see up there, all working together under a government contract to be able to deliver care at scale with meaningful improvements. And it takes that kind of effort to really, move things forward. A lot of collaboration. So, yeah, thanks for your time and appreciate it.